I hope to maybe expose you to some new ideas and new thinking, ways of thinking in the talk, specifically as we look at things like ethnomusicology, different cultures around the world. So this is a post-mortem not just on Trek to Yomi, but specifically on the music, and even more specifically about a very, not small part, but a very specific part in the music creation for Trek to Yomi. It is called Extracting Imperceptible Frequencies of Ancient Music and Creating the Sound of the Unknowable. It's a big title, but basically finding cool things in ancient music and showing it to people for the first time. So I am a composer and a music producer by trade, but I'm also the creative director and CEO of a conglomerate of audio companies where we have a record label, some music licensing. We have an end-to-end interactive audio solutions company. My history, which also pertains to this talk, is quite eclectic, from orchestral to pop and rock to EDM, and then in uni I kind of fell in love with ethnomusicology, which is the study of music cultures from around the world. So how does that all set up the music in Trek to Yomi? Well, it is a combination of a lot of different things, both traditional instruments, cultural music systems from the Edo period, and then all of that kind of put into a blender with the mind of an electronic music producer and a sound designer kind of all combined. And that's how we're going to find these imperceptible frequencies. Some great art by the Flying Wild Hog team, by the way. Had to change it up. Before I get started, I do want to ask a couple questions. Are we composers? Can I get some hands if you're a composer, if you write music? That's cool. How about sound designers, audio designers? A lot of them. Excellent. Developers, anything other than that? Love it. Great. Great. Legal department from the Flying Wild Hog team? No? Anywhere? Okay. Understood. I'll share all the secrets now. Before we get started, I want to start at the end. I want to play what this sounds like in context at the very end of the game, more or less. At least the end of the weird part, in my opinion, of the game, where the most extreme version of what I'm talking about is displayed. And so as we listen to this, try to keep this in mind as we journey through sort of all these different elements, as we start to combine them, and use this as a lens to think about some of these elements. So this is a piece of music that's on the soundtrack. It's called Echoes of Yomi, where you'll hear it. I'm gonna skip forward a little bit. Synthesizers. This is all source material from ancient styles of music and recorded instruments from the Edo period. It's a pretty smooth fade. Pretty smooth fade. Oh. Here we are. So, a quick setup to this game to get more context. What is Trek to Yomi? It's a love letter. It's an homage to, as some Japanese cinema fans might recognize, Akira Kurosawa and some of his films, such as Rashomon and Seven Samurai. This is 1940s, 1950s classic Japanese cinema. He's a very legendary director, and he worked with a very legendary composer as well that I took inspiration from, named Fumio Hayasaka, who traditionally worked with orchestral instruments, but he also worked with Edo period Japanese instruments, but had a very unique approach to, I guess, drama in the context of music. At this time, Western cinema was booming, and Japanese cinema kind of had their own unique approach to what drama meant musically, in terms of cinema as well. And so when we're looking at the music for this game, we're combining all of these together and fusing them for inspiration, where we're looking at the Edo period, the instruments that were there. We're looking at Fumio Hayasaka's musical approach to drama, and then of course taking inspiration from Akira Kurosawa's cinema and Seven Samurai, Rashomon. You can see here from some of the stills that the Flying Wild Hog team did a fantastic job of matching sort of that feeling of when you look at the game, you get the emotions that were created and that you have affiliated with 1940s, 1950s Akira Kurosawa films. So bravo to them. We can watch a quick trailer so you can see in context of how this game is performing and how it can feel like in a Kurosawa film.
平和は単なる幻に過ぎぬ。その喪失を嘆くなかれ。己の行いを悔やまずともよい。武士道というは死ぬことと見つけたり。その道を守るべし。己の命が尽き果てたその先まで。
Okay, well done. Yeah, do we want to give a little round of applause for our Flying Wild Hog friends? This is great. It's great. This is really well done. Really excellent. Well, okay, that's all great, but what is this Yomi place? You can think of the afterlife. It's more of like this, and I'm going to generalize here, so if there's any like Japanese history specialists, you can yell at me afterwards. But it's a purgatory-like afterlife place where there's all the degrees of the afterlife that you can imagine kind of in one place, but perhaps in layers. There's awesome and breathtaking, very beautiful things, which my music is not known for. And then there are very abstract and putrid hellscape-like places, which is, more my speed. You can see here on the screen, we have some on the bottom and on the top right, we have some historical drawings of depictions of Yomi, and then we have some concept art and then some in-game images as well of what this place looks like for context. I'm going to go through this section kind of quick. I have some QR codes that I'll put up on the screen because it's important to know where we started in terms of what I call the top side, the world of the living, and how we represented music in the Edo period with historical accuracy, and how that translates to what we did in the underworld with all this modern technology. So there will be QR codes at the end. You can scan them, and it's about 20 minutes of behind-the-scenes creation of that. But we wanted it to be a direct extension of the tool to further this immersion for Akira Kurosawa-inspired films, the Edo period. So on top of using something like this, Biwa is like 700 years old. This is a musician in Tokyo trying to use vintage recording equipment that we had accessibility to, because we were doing this during a pandemic as well. So we were trying to find as much 40s and 50s recording equipment as we could, and only using instruments that were available in the Edo period. And we're doing that as much as possible, but like I said, we had limited availability, limited resources, and we couldn't put more than 3 people in a studio at a time with sound dividers because of social distancing and things like that. But it worked really well for the game because this game feels smaller, more personal. Didn't make sense to have like this massive bed of orchestra and then just slam Japanese instruments on top of it for games you might know like Ghost of Tsushima or Sekiro, where that might have felt appropriate because of the grand scale of the game. But on top of all this, it's still a video game, so we took some liberties here and there to maybe amp up the drama, make things more exciting, brought in some instruments from some adjacent Japanese cultures, which then also leads into this sort of pan-Asian understanding of the afterlife. I'll come back to these, don't worry. So we talked about Yomi a little bit, but it's an interesting cross-section of musical opportunity where we want it heavily based in reality and historical accuracy, but it's also this totally fantastical and fictional world, but it's based on ancient literature, ancient art, And so we have an opportunity where they've never talked about what music in Yomi sounds like. So we're creating something completely fresh, completely unique, completely unknowable to anyone on the planet, whoever has been or whoever will be. And so as a music producer turned composer turned audio director, culture enthusiast, ethnomusicologist, multi-hyphenate, this weird sonic purgatory, but also is a visual purgatory. It's an opportunity for everyone on the team to invent and create a new look, a new feel, a new sound. So it's a perfect little playground. So we got started by doing a lot of research. I think that is the number one most respectful thing you can do when you're engaging with culture, specifically ancient culture that has hundreds of years of established literature, art, lore, history. And we did this for almost 2 years. We'd met the creator of the game in September of 2019, but we didn't fully put pen to paper until February of 2021. And this was on music, but heavily on culture, to understand the roots of where all of this comes from before we add kind of our own spin on top of that art form. So we were learning afterlife is sacred. Cool. What does sacred music sound like? This wild ensemble called a gagaku, which is a Japanese orchestra that follows a musical rules and a musicality that is nothing like Western music. So we're thinking, how do we stay true to this style? I've got 5 months to write this music. I can't learn an entire new music system in a matter of months and still write like 2 hours of music and then not have anyone get mad at me. So we decided to, instead of just doing composer gagaku, which I feel more and more people kind of lean into that and embrace just some of the colors and go on their way, we recorded the top 5 most historic, well-known gagaku pieces in a variety of different ways, right? No percussion, slower, take some breaks between phrases, only the reeds, only the flutes, things like that. So we had a very large sample pool to then go in and begin to use all those sound design techniques that we all know and love and cut things up, resample things, and we'll get a little deeper too. In our research of Yomi, specifically in this game too, it's kind of represented in levels. So you die, and sorry, spoiler alert, I know. You die and you instantly start working your way down through Yomi. And so we're thinking about how do we go a little deeper as we get farther from the point of transition to the afterlife. How do we represent that with sound? And the sort of foreshadowing moment here is the Doppler effect. But before I get any deeper, I do want to talk briefly about semiotics. So this is more of a philosophical concept that I try to embrace, and I also try to encourage people to think about when they are doing any type of creative work at all. This doesn't just apply to sound, this applies to, art or your gameplay mechanics. It's the idea that everything is a sign. You say the word dog, that is kind of the sign, but the symbol itself is the dog on the ground. So any musical gesture means something to someone, or at least it should. I don't believe in having kind of empty, nonsensical space in your music. So everything up to this point that we've seen, the Flying Wild Hog team has very carefully chosen, in this game, and just naturally, is a giant play on semiotics. They're evoking subconscious emotions by showing you imagery that might look like 1940s cinema. They're using sounds and colors. In terms of the sound design, Arthur's back here, he did a great job. In terms of the music, but not every sign, not every opportunity to kind of tap into someone's subconscious will have an emotional or a contextual response from all audience members. They might not have something already established to call back to. So in this case, it's a fabulous opportunity to establish the emotional context of what that sound or that piece of music or that art means. So as they continue their life, if they come back to the game, it'll have new, fresh sort of approach, a new flavor to it. Or as they experience something like gagaku, which we'll listen to in a second, later in life, they will always remember Trek to Yomi as the thing that established for them, whether it's conscious or subconscious. Oh, so just some more imagery. I forgot to go through these. So old recording technology, ancient instruments, taiko drums, flutes. These are shell horns called a horagai in Japan that a musician had sanded off the top of that actually had different pitches. We were able to record these in a variety of different pitches and resample them. So how do we do semiotics? How do we make something like Yomi that doesn't have a sound or music associated with it? How do we create signs that are affiliated with that? How do we tap into people's subconsciouses and create something evocative? And it took a little bit of R&D and some research, but we worked hard at it. And the main idea here that we really dived deep into, which I hinted at earlier, was the Doppler effect, which as you die and you get farther away from the point in which you crossed over into the underworld, how does that affect sound? How does that affect music? Visually in the game, as you progress, it gets more abstract, it gets darker, it gets very mysterious and scary and very spooky, and gravity's inverting, and there's a lot of things that contrast the world of living as you get deeper into the game. So the Doppler effect, which you may or may not know, you can think of it very simply as an object accelerates towards you, the wavelengths shrink and the pitch increases, and as the object travels away from you, the wavelengths expand and the pitch will decrease. So the point at which you are at the object, or it is at you, we can think of that as the point in the game in which you die, and as you travel away from that, the music and the sound lengthens. It extends. So I have an example here, which is just a poorly recorded ambulance, but I think this will demonstrate kind of the idiomatic idea of the Doppler effect. Or at least it should play. There we go. Well, I don't have any sound. 1 second. We'll come back to that. It's a small example. We have audio samples at the end, and we'll just play through them. All is good. So this isn't a direct representation of what the game is like, but I was thinking in this way. Think of it like the movie Inception. As you go deeper, layer after layer, time continues to expand while the layers above it are actually at a normal sort of passage of time. So as we're thinking of this, like what happens when you stretch sound? What happens when you stretch, an image? There's actual math, and with sound, there's actual physics that happen to digitized sound as you stretch it. And so we had all of this traditionally recorded Edo period music. We stretched it, and it had a very cool vibe, but because of the materials and the technology we were using is from very dated, it's 1940s, 1950s, the fidelity of it as we stretched it was degrading. As you take a 1 second sound, you stretch it to 2 seconds, you can drop it in 1 octave, but it shifts the entire frequency range. So you lose all of the high-end sizzle and all the high-end fidelity. But because if you had 20,000 hertz, you stretch it, double its length, it's now 10,000 hertz. So you lose a lot of that as you continue to stretch things. And this was before we had recorded the Gagaku, so we're thinking, like, how do we record higher frequency content? How do we preserve that with as much fidelity as possible? So all of this music in the underworld still has some great transients and some great information. So what we leaned into here was ultimately ultrasonic microphones. We found these frequency response curves at Stanford University, which, I don't know, research is great, so thank you, Stanford, that showed the frequency response of one of the instruments, the hichiriki, up to 61,000 hertz. The human hearing stops at 20,000 hertz. So there's 40,000 hertz of information that no one on the planet has ever heard before. And we can see it here too. It's just a different fundamental at 25,000 hertz, and on the far side at 33,000 hertz. So this got me really excited because there are microphones that can go up to 80,000, 100,000 hertz. So we embrace that to try and keep that fidelity at the top end. Going farther, since now we're really embracing this idea of like, okay, the source content will stay the same, but what else can we do to take that source content as far as possible using the current modern technologies? So we embraced ambisonic recording, which for those who don't know what ambisonic is more or less being able to create a 3D representation of sound only using like headphones, 2 speakers. And so my thought was, this is the traditional layout for a gagaku ensemble. Like, imagine if you just closed your eyes and placed yourself right behind this big drum in front of the leader of the ensemble, and this ensemble was surrounding you as they were playing. And so in a studio environment, we wanted much more flexibility, so the musicians were very uncomfortable with this arrangement because they've never played in this arrangement before, but I managed to convince them to be placed in a circle so each musician is equidistant from the ambisonic microphone in the middle, and then also you can see all the different microphones. We had like 40 to 50 microphones in this recording setup, and then also the ultrasonic microphone array in the center. And while we're also doing this, because we want high frequency content, we had to do a little more acoustic research, and you find that the frequency response is half of your sample rate. So we had to record this at an extremely high sample rate and bit rate to have as much fidelity as possible, right? Because we're trying to preserve as much of that source content as possible before we then go and just do awful, distorted things to it. So we're there, and you can see this red line is, again, how do we go farther? How do we go deeper? How do we do more interesting things with this source content? Because again, we didn't write it. We're just capturing what has already been there, what has been there for 700 years. So how do we put our own literal spin on it? Well, since we're in an ambisonic format and we have kind of this digitized 3D soundstage, I could slowly turn this. So in actuality, it's the listener's position is moving around, but it feels like this ensemble is circling around you. So if you were to close your eyes and just have this play, it would feel like you were just slowly turning, or the ensemble's turning around you, and your perspective is being forced to change between each musician. So now not only is it a very foreign style of music, we have recorded it and time stretched it and done all this very weird, awful stuff to it, and actually it's pretty cool, but now it's forcing you to think about it and listen to it differently every 30 seconds, every 15 seconds, however fast we spun it. I found that if I spun this ensemble too fast, it actually made me quite sick. So I decided to move it very, very, very slowly, and it has quite a unique effect if you were to listen to it on headphones. And because we recorded at high fidelities, I had several terabytes of source content, so it was a lot to deal with. And one last anecdote, too, is when we were doing our last recording session, we had planned all this, we were kind of done. I'd just written the last main piece, it was that first piece you had heard at the end there, and we found a reverb chamber in the recording studio at the end of a session. And so just for fun, I passed through one of our stems through the reverb chamber. It sounded pretty cool, so we did that with each of the stems from that cue. Sounded all right. Decided to sum those together and pass the whole thing through the reverb chamber with 20% feedback. So what we were capturing on our end, at the same time, we were putting back into the reverb chamber. And we did this 5-6 times in a row. And there have been some experimental musicians over the years who have done something like this, but I never had an opportunity to try it and really embrace it and kind of do my own spin on it. By the time we were done, after running it through 4, 5, 6 times, the music, the source content itself had just completely dissipated, and the space itself had taken on its own sound, its own metallic rattle, sort of cacophonous, terrifying sound. And we laid in the reverb chamber in the last take and just let our bodies be permeated by 700-year-old ancient sacred ensembles that we then captured with technology in 2021, hundreds of years after it was ever conceived or thought of, and then now pumped through a space specifically designed for capturing music in a way that they could never have imagined. And it was this very almost spiritual musical moment of seeing all of these elements come together in a very unique, special way that might not have ever been able to do, or no one may have never thought to do, especially thinking about there's frequencies, in this music that have only ever been subconsciously processed. The hair on our skin might have felt 80,000 hertz, but never in the history of the world has anyone ever heard any of that information, let alone had they known it was there. And only with using technology 700, 800 years after the conception of this style of music are we actually able to perceive it in a unique way by recording it at extremely high fidelity and time stretching it. And then on top of all of it, this project for us, whether the Hogs knew it or not, turned into kind of a musical preservation project where by recording these ensembles at such a high fidelity, I can say with complete confidence, we have recorded the highest fidelity gagaku in the history of the world. And so that's pretty cool for any ethnomusicologists out there, or anyone who's interested in preserving culture. I think video games are one of the only places where you can embrace something like that and really see it through to the end. All right, let's listen to some. Oh, I hope it works. It does work. So this is a sample of what a gagaku sounds like, just right out of the board, recorded, no processing. This is what the original sounds like. What the style ends up sounding like is called heterophony, which is multiple instruments playing the same melody at the same time. And it creates a lot of very interesting sort of tension and rub in the sound itself, which as we stretch it, as I play through these examples, you will begin to hear some of these oscillations come out in a much more pronounced way. So here's that same phrase, but twice the length. And 4 times the length. So you can hear the envelope of the sound takes much, much longer to develop, and there's a lot more nuance that you might not have been able to hear before because the moment passes pretty quickly, but now all of this new information is being exposed as we drop it, but there's still high frequencies because of all that fun sound math based on all the research we had done. And so this is 3 octaves. It's 8 times the original length of the source material. So we had recorded for about 90 minutes straight with this ensemble, 40 microphones, 192K hertz, 32-bit. And so by the time I started experimenting with this, it could have turned into 12, 24, 36 hours of content just by simply stretching it to these lengths. So I had a lot of stuff. I have a lot of great content still that's totally unused because it didn't find a place in this game. These are the examples of the reverb chamber, which is not necessarily part of the core idea of what we wanted to accomplish with this game, but it represents the spirit, the creative and sort of experimental spirit that the Hogs sort of embraced and let us run with, and just at the very last minute ended up doing this. So I'll play the first track here, which is when we ran all the stems through the chamber itself, and I'll back-to-back play when we ran it through again and again, and you can slowly start to, actually rather quickly, start to hear the original source content just kind of smear away and just disappear, and the space itself, the reverb chamber, takes on a personality and starts to kind of rattle and shimmer and do some very, very interesting things. Still hear some of that gagaku coming through. You can hear some of the drums, some of the reedy instruments and the flutes. And as we get to this 3 times through, it starts to disappear a little bit. this fourth time through, it's just the sound of the reverb chamber itself. But it's a representation, again, more of the source material taken to as far of an extreme as you can to create new and evocative and interesting ideas. And this is nothing else added, but just ran back through in succession. That like metallic ringing in the top end that wasn't present on the last pass, that definitely wasn't present in any of the stems. So you get some new, I was very happy to receive this. I cut it throughout the track. Sometimes I played all of them, sometimes I played none of them. I resampled a lot of this, like some of that metallic ringing, and added it to other pieces in the game. I didn't want to play that. And so these are the final iterations of what's in the game. I'm going to play you first an example of one of the most popular Gagaku pieces. Oh, yes, thank you. I'm not done yet. One of the most popular Gagaku pieces called Itenraku. And this is on the soundtrack. We put a second disc on the Trek to Yomi soundtrack that has the Gagaku pieces that we recorded as is, so people can hear them, so people can hear where this music comes from, what it's inspired by, and it was part of our sort of endeavor to preserve this culture and this music in a way that has never been done before. So this is what a Gagaku sounds like, just straight up, just a recording of this famous piece. There's a lot of complex musicality that goes into this that doesn't exist in what's called Western music. There's a lot of very dissonant chords, a lot of interesting heterophony. So to try and learn how to do this very quickly would have been a massive amount of disrespect to this musical style. So now we can listen to what this sounds like. Oh gosh, I'm gonna play all of them at once. So this is in context. As we move through Yomi, no synthesizers, no MIDI. I didn't write a single note into my computer. I did it all based on just my ear and listening to pitches, matching them very carefully to each other, balancing frequencies, adjusting, small information here and there, and then adding the usual bucket of crazy sound design technology on top of it to make things more spacious, weirder sounding. So a lot of those momentary chords that happen on this pipe flute that they're playing, it's like this. Oh, I thought that was my microphone, but can actually come out and hold that chord out, and we can actually take some of those moments and stitch them together into new melodies, into new harmonic progressions. So there's a lot of liberties taken as we dove into the source content, and ultimately we end up where we began with this piece called Echoes of Yomi, which represents like the darkest, deepest, scariest part of the game. So this piece, if you were to listen to it on headphones, has that swirling effect. In the game, you're kind of going down this vortex until there's this sort of singularity at the bottom that will send you back up to save the one you love. And as you go down, this is the piece that is following you as you travel deeper and deeper down this vortex. But ultimately, the goal here, right, is to take ancient, could be ancient, it could be a culture that is existing right now, and perhaps instead of trying to do what I call a composer version or whatever your art form is version of that, you can research to understand where the culture is coming from, where the music is coming from, enough to know how to respectfully adapt it before you really go off the deep end and push it to new places by applying, whatever new technologies you might have in your specific art form. Here, I just happen to do it with advanced microphones and, sonic math inside of my computer and time stretching algorithms and all sorts of other interesting things, but it ended up presenting the source content in a very unique and in a way that actually preserves it and brings it into the modern and exposes it to people who may have never heard it before, but also exposes information as part of that information of that art form that no one in the history of the world has ever been able to perceive before. So there's absolutely merit in using your modern technologies to find new meaning and to establish those new semiotic connections and to create new signs and opportunities of subconscious connection. And that's it.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for Q&A session. Please come to us.
Come to me.
What is your name?
Stanisław. So, did you maybe think about distributing the gogoku sounds as a contact instrument or VST?
Yes.
Okay. And?
It's complicated.
Okay.
So ultimately that is complicated when you're working on a game. There's a lot of, legal things that are going on with who owns sound recordings. I have since talked to people like Spitfire Orchestral Tools about creating a library of sounds that are similar to what I ended up, where I ended up, like a sound design thing. Creating a library of something like this would be very difficult, right? Because we're using tools that are created based around like Western music systems, and so ultimately a lot of these conversations end up like, how do we actually do this? And it gets complicated, right? So yes. Okay. The answer is yes. I hope someday. Yeah, absolutely. It would be great to make it more accessible. Some of these individual instruments, like the Hichiriki, the Ryuteki, the Sho, exist as solo instruments. The company Sonica has a couple of sample libraries, so we were able to buy those sounds and use them as writing tools in certain areas, or kind of use them as sound design tools and reincorporate them. So those are available, individual instruments, but not the ensemble.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hello, I'm James. Thank you for the fascinating talk. It sounds like it was an incredible experience. Do have a couple of questions, but we'll see who else jumps up. The reverb chamber, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit of the technical process of that. Was it constantly looping through, or did you record through, then re-record that back through?
Yeah, so the first time was just an experiment, right? Like sending stems into it, just fully wet coming back. And then on the subsequent passes, we just do the whole, I think that whole track is like 6 minutes long. So we would send all those stems through. So I spent a lot of money on studio time sending like individual stems through. And after we did that, then that's where we kind of experimented by sending a feedback loop back into the chamber. And so it'd be 20% more or less like back into the chamber and striped it. So we would have that, and then we would start over and take that recording and feed it back in with another 20%. So it was very additive in what we were trying to do, because effectively I was trying to embrace some of that experimental like reverb chamber music, I think from like the 60s and the 70s, and do like our own spin on that. And so it was always about being additive and trying to bring out the natural sound of that chamber.
Cool.
Yeah.
What microphones did you use? The ultrasonic ones?
Let's go back here. I don't know. I can just send you this. Just email me and I'll send it to you. I did this a long time ago. I can't see off the top of my head. Maybe it might have been the B&K 4006. Or no, maybe that one too. I'll send you a mic list.
Okay.
You let me know.
Also, just how did you use the Doppler in the end? Was it quite an abstract use, or was it sort of specific sort of instances, events where you used it? Or?
It was more of an inspiration about how to treat the game chapter by chapter, right?
Okay.
So at this inflection point right here where we die, the idea was that this chapter then kind of drops in pitch.
Right.
And as we go to this chapter, this fragment expands out to here, and this fragment expands here. So it was more of an inspiration rather than a literal depiction of the Doppler. But of course, like, elements of that were embraced first. And you might have heard some in that last piece, like instruments that feel like they fly by you. So it wasn't quite literal, but more of an inspiration to address this hierarchy of levels as you go deeper.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, thank you for presentation. My name is Jacob, I'm a sound designer, and I have very specific sound design question.
Okay, I don't want to let you down. All right.
Because you wanted to keep the best fidelity when stretching these stems, did you try a lot of different stretching processors, and which one did you go for the best quality?
So, yeah, absolutely. When we had all of the source content, we probably sat with it for about 2 weeks. And we being, I have my company and I have sound designers at my company. And so I was kind of guiding people to creating this big pool of content together. And we were using like the classics like Paul Stretch at times. And then the Logic time stretch, I think it's just the pitch function, is probably one of the best time stretch tools to use like in real time in DAW. And so that was one of my main tools that I used, where I would, on top of all this other sound design content we had made inside of like a big bucket well of one shots, right? Yeah. I had the multi-track in Logic. So I was running like 100 and almost 200 tracks at any given time at 192K. It did drop it to 24-bit once I was in Logic, because it's not a 32-bit environment. But once, it was an insane amount of processing too. But Logic was able to, I grouped everything, was able to time stretch things in real time. So I could shorten something until it was like an A, and then the next phrase elongate it until it was an F, and actually create some like harmonic changes within the context of the music by batch processing all 40 multi-tracks at the same time. So just all the normal tools you use on a day-to-day basis is...
Yeah, so it's just basically stretching within the DAW of
Yeah,
Logic.
and then Twisted Wave, Paul Stretch, used Absinthe, although it's so hard to use these days. Just any sound design tool we had on our computer, I would drop it in granulizers, all sorts of
so
stuff.
it was actually a mix of a couple of...
A mix of everything that was on any computer at the time.
Oh, okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Cody, for your presentation, for your deep knowledge, and thank you very much for everyone. Yes, and big applause for our guest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.